There was an uneasy feeling on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange that day. Many more investors wanted to sell stocks than buy them. Attempts at trading became so hectic that ticker tape machines fell hours behind in reporting transactions. But with more sellers than buyers, stock values declined rapidly as sellers took whatever offers they could get. According to the New York Times, fear struck the big investors and the little ones. Thousands of them threw their holdings into the whirling stock exchange pit for what they would bring. At a time when trading 5 million shares in a day was considered heavy, 12,894,600 shares had changed hands, and October 24th, 1929, became known as Black Thursday. For several days afterward, bankers and financiers tried to shore up the sagging market with personal funds and with optimistic reassurances. But on Tuesday, October 29th, came the crash. The New York Times estimated that investors lost up to $14 billion as practically every stock plummeted. Dazed and confused, brokers wandered out onto Wall Street, as if fearing that the stock exchange building itself might collapse. Traffic snarled, and mounted police tried to keep order. Hundreds huddled at the foot of George Washington's statue, as if hoping that the father of their country might yet save them. But the unthinkable had happened. By mid-November, the stock market registered losses on paper of almost $30 billion. To many, it seemed like the end of the world. The stock market crash did not by itself cause the depression of the 1930s. The warning signs of an economic disaster had been present throughout the 1920s. But the signs were not as easy to read then as they are now. The booming 20s spawned a number of get-rich-quick schemes. In Florida, for example, real estate speculators furiously bought up beachfront properties in hopes of reselling them at huge profits. Investors bought the properties in hopes of developing them and selling them again for even greater profits. It did not seem to bother either the speculators or the investors that many of the properties were simply swamps or marshland. But all hopes for quick profits were soon dashed when a hurricane devastated the few developments that had been attempted. Also, a nostalgic memory of the past kept many people from realizing that some Americans never really shared in the economic boom of the 1920s. Urbanites, for example, like to remember the farm as a quiet, peaceful pocket of prosperity. By supplying America's troops and her allies with needed produce, American farmers did prosper during the First World War. But the end of the war brought an end to that prosperity. While new methods of growing helped farmers produce more crops, and new forms of transportation helped them deliver those crops faster, shrinking U.S. markets could not absorb them. As farm surpluses mounted, prices fell. To counteract falling prices, farmers tried to end the surpluses by declaring a farmers' holiday and withholding their goods from market. But the holiday only hurt helpless urbanites and aroused public resentment. As a last resort, farmers began destroying their own produce. Milk was poured on the ground, fields were plowed under, and animals were shot. But the problem was too big to be solved by such desperate measures. Continued declining incomes led to mortgage foreclosures and forced sales of farms, sometimes accompanied by violence, or at least by the threat of violence on the part of unsympathetic and equally desperate creditors. All farmers suffered under these conditions, but particularly the elderly, with limited resources, and minority group members who were sometimes singled out for economic discrimination. A similar pattern of want in the midst of plenty developed in mining communities. Miners, like farmers, had prospered during World War I, when the demand for fuel and metal had been high. But when the demand dropped at the war's end, so did the employment of miners. And no men wanted signs became depressingly common. By the mid-1920s, unemployment was becoming a problem in other industries. Increased automation, for example, created new jobs only for those with new skills. Even in the booming construction industry, business tapered off when a glut in the housing market surfaced. In 1927, consumer spending on manufactured goods declined, leaving producers with many unmarketable items, no matter how low their prices. Despite these economic danger signs, it looked as though the decade were going to close on an optimistic note. Even though Calvin Coolidge chose not to run for re-election, his Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, easily won the 1928 presidential race for the Republican Party. Hailed as one of the chief engineers of the booming 20s and famed for administering food to European victims of the First World War, President Hoover displayed the same confidence that still permeated the Congress and the country. In his initial speeches, the new chief executive admitted that there were some problems, but he added, "In no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure." Hoover would live to regret those words. Encouraged by the president's reassurances and driven by their own dreams of making a killing in the market, investors went on a buying binge. Unfortunately, much of the buying was done through brokerage houses on margin, that is, on the payment of only a fraction of the total cost of the stock. And much of the margin buying was done on speculation, that is, on the chance of making quick profits from rapid price changes. When various businesses and industries failed to show their expected profits, brokers tried to reel in their loans, only to find an insolvent speculator dangling at the end of their line. The ensuing stock market crash created a falling dominoes effect, which toppled businesses and industries as well as individuals. Even if the speculators had savings put away for an emergency, they often discovered that their banks had invested their savings in the stock market too. As one writer remarked, the banks provided everything for their customers but a roulette wheel. By the end of the decade, almost 7,000 banks closed their doors to depositors whose life savings they could not return. The image of a bankrupt businessman selling apples on a street corner was no myth. It became an all too familiar reality. Because builders could not get bank loans, business in the construction industry fell from $5 billion in 1925 to $3 billion in 1929. And uncompleted projects meant more unemployment. Even though the automobile industry continued to grow, it grew at a much slower rate than it had at the beginning of the decade. And the automobile's slowed growth rate retarded production in related industries, such as oil, steel, glass, and rubber. The federal government could have taken a more active role in the economic crisis, but President Hoover decided, for the most part, to cut back on federal expenditures. It was not that Hoover was insensitive to the plight of thousands of businessmen and millions of workers. It was just that he believed in Coolidge's sit down and keep still philosophy of government. The president hoped, for example, that without government interference, the stock market would naturally change from a cautious bear or selling market to a confident bull or buying market. But when his hopes for the stock market failed to materialize, Hoover appealed to business and labor leaders to have faith in the gospel of laissez-faire and trust in the Republican promise that prosperity was just around the corner. In addition to this appeal, the president did authorize a farm relief program and eventually did take more initiative than any previous administration in combating a depression. But his reliance on voluntary measures offered too little, too late. While the Republicans were not solely responsible for the worsening economic conditions, the public blamed Hoover and his administration. Hoovervilles, shacks built by people who had lost their homes or who could no longer pay their rents, sprang up on the outskirts of once prosperous cities and silently protested the president's policies. Not so silent were the protests for food and for unemployment compensation. When protests were not heard, picket lines formed. But when picket lines were not effective, people turned to soup lines, bread lines, and employment lines. Americans never became accustomed to the faces of poverty, hunger, and despair. Although many Americans in the years from 1929 to 1933 felt forced to resign themselves to the philosophy of sit down and keep still.